Welcome to Physicians Who Lead, the podcast where we sit down with physician leaders who are shaping the future of healthcare. Each episode, we dive into the real challenges facing our system today and hear directly from the physicians leading the way with innovation, resilience, and vision. If you want to understand how healthcare is changing and meet the leaders driving that change, you're in the right place.
Good morning. Today, my guest on the Physicians Who Lead podcast is Dr. Anthony Weiss, based out of Boston. And we're going to talk about his path into leadership and what physician leadership means to him. So, Dr. Weiss, thank you for coming on today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun. We're getting near the holiday season here. So we'll keep it nice and light today. But can you talk to me a bit about kind of how you started as a physician, what area clinically you were in and stuff like that, and then take us through how you got to where you are and kind of what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my path to physician leadership is somewhat unique, but as you do this work, I think there is not a single path to physician leadership, and I think that's an important message. So I'll start with the end. So I'm presently the chief medical officer here at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. And I'm on faculty at Harvard Medical School. I'm an associate professor there. And so the work I do here at BIDMC is primarily focused on managing and working with our medical staff, working with the chiefs of the departments of the hospital, and overseeing quality, safety, regulatory affairs for the medical center. And I've been doing this work here at BIDMC now for about 7 years. And prior to that, I was the CMO at Upstate University Hospital in Syracuse, New York. So overall, have been a chief medical officer for probably 12, 13 years now. But I didn't start really actually interested in being a CMO. As many physicians, I started with an interest in clinical medicine and actually found my love in the brain. I was very excited and interested in the brain and how the brain regulates activity within our bodies, but also helps us to understand the world around us. And was torn between psychiatry and neurology, ended up more or less doing both. I'm board certified in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry, and started to do neuroscience research to begin my career, interested in memory and cognition as it's affected in some mental illness. But quickly found that I was puzzled by where the research was actually going in the real world, and found that the care that patients receive, patients with schizophrenia, for example, in the real world, was not at any point in my lifetime probably going to be impacted by the magnetoencephalography research I was doing in the lab. And so it made me refocus on how are we applying the clinical evidence we already have? How are we applying the research that's already been conducted? And that got me into the world of quality and safety. And so for me, then it was a series of successive pivots. And I think that's an important message for physicians who are interested in going from the bedside into leadership, is thinking about where do you start from, and then how can you create successive pivots to get you to a place that you want to go. So for me specifically, I started in quality in psychiatry and then found ways to look at quality across the hospital. So for example, screening for addiction in primary care at Mass General Hospital, where I was previously. And then figuring out, okay, now you're doing that work and you're getting physicians to get engaged in clinical improvement. What about other ways to get physicians engaged? So at that time, this is dating myself a little bit, but e-prescribing was new. So this idea of how do we get physicians to e-prescribe? Well, Tony, you've done some nice work in this area. Could you help us with this? So did that. And then more on the electronic medical record system, got more engaged in that, then clinical policy, then joint commission preparation. And so it was a series of these successive pivots, if you will, so that each pivot didn't seem to come out of left field, because going from doing magnetoencephalography research to being a chief medical officer is quite a leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as you approach this with successive pivots from a place where you have strength, I think that can be a helpful perspective. And so that's essentially what I've done and where I am today.
So you just mentioned, improving physician engagement and stuff like that. What things did you do to get to get the physicians to being more engaged? Because I think that's a big issue right now in a lot of health systems, is that, we keep asking physicians to do more, see more patients, and but at the same time, we're hearing about burnout, and we're hearing about a lot of these different aspects. And I get a sense that the engagement is lower and stuff like that. So I'd be interested to hear how you've increased engagement in the past.
Yeah, I think initially, and I guess to some degree, it's about trying to frame the change in a language and in a perspective that, as a physician, you can understand. So why are we doing this? Kind of presenting the bigger picture. One of the benefits, I guess, if you will, of being a CMO is, first of all, I have very little formal authority, and so there's not a lot of hire fire activity or anything like that, as a CMO. But what I do have is the ability to sit at tables where you see that bigger picture, and I think that comes as both a blessing and a curse. And that's another important lesson for physicians interested in leadership. The blessing is that you can start to see that bigger picture, and you can start to see why an organization like a hospital or a physician group even, or a medical system, might be interested in moving in a certain direction. And then it's about communicating that why to the physicians that work within your team. And so having the ability to kind of see around you with a bit more perspective is very helpful, because most physicians, and even I'd say most chiefs, are focused in their domain. The physicians are focused often on the patient in front of them or on their clinic schedule ahead of them. And the chief might be focused specifically on their domain, let's say
Mhm.
cardiology. And it's when you get a chance to sit at these tables and see this broader perspective that you can better understand the why. And then it's about communicating the why to physicians. And in general, with transparency and honesty, most physicians are going to be appreciative and will come on board with, oh, now I see, that makes sense. And listening to some of their objections, because when you hear about foot dragging or kind of physicians being against change, sometimes it's, oh, how do you overcome resistance? I think that's not the right frame.
Mhm.
I think it's more about, how do you understand their perspective, and how do you then incorporate that into the change, rather than trying to drive change over the doctors. The curse, I guess, of being able to see that broader perspective, and this is again a real challenge for physicians as they move up from the bedside, let's say, to a division chief, to a chief level, is that there's always this sense of, well, hey, have you forgotten about us, right? So as you see that bigger picture, let's say you move from the bedside, now you're the division chief. Now you need to focus not just on the group of docs that you were working with previously. You've got to think about your whole division, right?
Mhm.
Or when you become the chief of a department, now it's not just the division that you came from, it's the other divisions. Or when you're the CMO, I generally am not necessarily focused on the Department of Psychiatry, even though I am a psychiatrist. And so that can come at a cost. And some physicians can't manage that. They can't manage the sense of, okay, I actually have broader responsibilities now that I'm seeing that broader perspective. And it's hard for them to kind of convey that to people that they were connected to at one point. So, but I think that's the key approach to, at least that's the approach I've taken to managing kind of the resistance.
Well, and it's interesting because that resonates, because some of the other leaders I've talked to have mentioned things like, you as a physician, you are tasked to focus on one patient in front of you, right? And get them stable if you're an emerge, or get them through a surgery if you're a surgeon. And then going and looking at resources globally is often a perspective shift. The other thing I've heard is the timelines for things, right? Often you are making decisions in real time as a clinician, and then all of a sudden you have to make decisions and move through activities that may take 6 months, to implement a new process or to implement change and stuff like that. So often I've heard that developing that patience and understanding of that timeline is definitely sometimes a bit of a challenge. And then the other thing that I hear a lot of is the timelines that you are involved in decision making, right? And I had a physician say that he's often given the decision and then intended to herd the physicians, right? So have you found a way in your career to be part of the decision making with corporate administration, whether it be a CEO or CNO or something else, early on in the process, so that it's not delivered to you as a notion of, okay, now please get the physicians on board, right?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of really good points there, Kevin. So first, let me double down on the timeline issue. I think that's really important, and it's going to seem a little bit mystical, but I really think that each of us has kind of a certain, I don't know, maybe a kind of an energy or an energy pulse or something like that. I have to find a better way to frame that, but and those different energies can conflict with each other. So for example, those energies are on loops of time. And so some people operate on a much longer time scale. Like they're comfortable with uncertainty and uncertainty at a much longer time scale. Maybe a little stereotypical, but psychiatrists typically are okay with that. They're okay with, okay, this is gray area territory. This is uncertain. I'm not sure what's going to happen with this person. I'm just going to work with them. And over maybe months, sometimes years, we might see some improvement in their situation, and that's going to be good. Whereas, again, stereotypically, emergency medicine physicians, their time frame is like that, right?
Yeah.
They've got to, or surgeons to some degree, and the degree of uncertainty, open loops. They're generally not that comfortable with that. They need to come to
Right.
closure and then move on. Come to closure and move on, right? And so that's really important in terms of, this concept of know yourself. For physicians who are interested in leadership, it's really, really important to introspect on that piece because generally, especially in larger systems or in a large hospital, the change can occur a bit more slowly. And that can be very, very, very frustrating for some physicians. And it's important to introspect to say, am I actually comfortable with decisions that may be a little bit nebulous or with timelines that are a bit longer than I'm used to?
Hmm.
And if the answer to that is no, I don't think I am comfortable with that, maybe leadership within a system like this is not really the direction you should aim for. Maybe it is more startups or ways in which you can contribute in a broader capacity, but at a kind of faster time scale, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a really important point. The second point is also really, really important. And a sense right now, or I think in general, that change is being put upon us as physicians. And that's why it's so important to have physicians interested in becoming leaders in healthcare, right? And so it's in part so that you can be at the table and see and have an impact on decisions early before they're being put upon, your fellow physicians. And I think,
Hmm.
again, I have the luxury now of being at the table and being part of those conversations, at least here at the hospital level and increasingly at the system level in which I work, around exactly those kind of decisions. How should we implement our hospital at home program, or what are the right ways to incorporate AI into our organization in a way that's going to be helpful clinically, right? And but again, I think that's an important message that we need physician leadership, and to the degree that physicians are engaged and do have the capacity to both see that bigger picture and communicate well with their colleagues, I think that will help so that physicians as a whole don't feel like change is being thrust on them, but rather feel as though they're part of the actors that are creating that change.
The last two questions I'll have for you are kind of more of a future state type of thing, and I would ask that how do we encourage more physicians to be leaders as the first component, and then secondly, how do we support them to be leaders and support our existing physician leaders?
Yeah. I think on that first question, I think out of the burnout and out of the frustration that a lot of physicians are feeling, I think that there's two directions you could go in. You could pull away from that and just put your head down and say, I'm just gonna I'm just going to see my patients and pretend like the world outside is okay, and get through the day and maybe get through my career and then hang it up.
Right.
That is certainly one direction that a number of physicians are taking, and that's unfortunate. Understandable at some level, but unfortunate. The other approach, which is an approach I feel I'm seeing a lot more of, especially amongst early career physicians, even the Harvard medical students, is how can I'm interested in healthcare. I'm interested in helping people. I'm interested in the clinical aspects of medicine. How can I make a difference? How can I make this better? And that's the right I shouldn't say that's the right approach, but I think that's a healthier approach, is to lean into it a bit more. And then the question is, well, for those who are interested and know that this doesn't sit right with them, or they want to make a difference, how do they make that difference? I think the podcasts that you're doing are helpful, because physicians can get exposure to um, you know healthcare leaders, around both in Canada and here in the United States. I think reaching out to physician leaders, saying, I'm starting out on this journey. I'm not sure the right way to pursue this or move forward. What are your thoughts? And again, most physicians want to help other docs to help in the problem solving. I think the other piece, which I mentioned earlier, is really important. That many physicians get frustrated, and now all of a sudden, they're a cardiologist in the cath lab, and now all of a sudden they want to be, the CEO of a big system, or they're, a primary care doctor in rural Canada, and now they want to run the healthcare system for Canada, and that's a natural inclination, because we're smart, bright people. Physicians typically have done well in school, and they have good knowledge capability, and they think, I could do that, I could fix this. And so it's a typical inclination to want to move from this frustrated position and stance to do something bigger. But this pivot approach is in my mind the key. So how can you take the position that you are today and leverage that, whether that's trying to drive some change within your physician group, maybe joining a local society, a physician society, and trying to figure out, well, how do I impact policy here locally? How do I put in place some better approaches to managing X clinically, because I'm frustrated by how we're managing this kind of condition, and then pivoting from there. And again, that process of pivoting does take a bit of patience, but in that patience, you kind of have to introspect to say, if I'm not patient enough to manage this kind of pivot change, I may not be the right temperament for that kind of leadership to begin with. And then, but I think it's reaching out, finding mentorship, finding supports. Oftentimes, when I was first starting out, I would reach out. I asked a ton of ignorant questions early on, but mentors were very kind. But it was also looking at trying to think about beginning with the end in mind, the kind of Stephen Covey concept of beginning with the end in mind. And so that is, look at the CV or the resume or the bio of a physician leader that you respect, and see what kind of experiences that they had. Not trying to replicate those identically, because I think that's a mistake, but thinking about, okay, if I want to get to that position, what would I need to have in place as I'm interviewing for that position to be credible?
Yeah.
And if I'm a rural physician and now I'm interviewing to be the chief medical officer at a major hospital in Toronto, that's not going to be credible.
Yeah.
You need to think about, well, how do I gain credibility starting from where I am and then pivoting and then achieving it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of the times when I'm talking to a physician that's expressed interest in going down that path, some of the advice you give is, okay, look to see what corporate projects you can be involved in, right? And you have to make somewhat of a commitment, because often they're not paid things. So, you have to understand that you're gonna, you're building your network and reputation, at the expense of time and stuff like that. I do think that, mentorship is a really big thing. We've started including coaching as part of our placements, so that we can invest in the person being successfully onboarded and retained, hopefully, which then we hope that will, allow them to build engagement and retention with the clinical physicians as well. And, we're looking to work with organizations that want to do the succession planning as well, so that we can look at our physicians and say, okay, well, these are the different things that we want to teach and for them to learn, and try and create some semblance of an individualized plan. Because I think the notion of saying, hey, everybody do an MHA, or hey, we're going to put in a leadership forum program within our hospital is great. But I also think that, mentorship, either formal or otherwise, allows you to consider who you bring to work. Right. And, I'm doing a chief of staff search right now. And, part of the plan is that, we'll provide 12 weeks of coaching for the person that's in the role. And it's not intended to say, okay, now we'll help you learn finance, or we'll help you learn, the EMR or whatever, or the email system and stuff like that. It's really intended to say, okay, how does Dr. Jones show up to work, and how do they have a support structure to say, okay, I'm trying to build a relationship with my CEO. What suggestions might you have, right? So I really want to look at things from the role of supporting healthcare leaders to, to grow and to do as well as they can, so that they're successful and they can lead the change that we need systematically, right? So that's, it's interesting that, what you've talked about and stuff like that. So have you had a mentor that stands out to you in your career to this point?
I've had several mentors. And early on, I reached out to Dr. Gary Gottlieb, who was at that time a psychiatrist who led Partners Healthcare, and he was very patient. And I think I wasted an hour of his time one time with ignorant questions, but he helped me. My residency training director, Dr. John Herman, remains an important mentor in my life. And then, of course, I've had scientific mentors, Scott Rausch and Stefan Heckers, and many, many others along the way. My CEOs have been important. Dr. John McCabe at Upstate University Hospital, and now I have two bosses here, Pete Healy and Alexa Kimball. They're both incredible leaders, and I've learned a ton from them as well. So yeah,
That's very
mentorship is really important, both in terms of actual outside mentorship, but also learning to some degree from your bosses and from your colleagues. I've been blessed with incredible colleagues. I just want to put a pin on something you said, because we run a physician leadership program here at BILH. That's the broader system that I work in here in Boston. And there are three components to that. And I just mention that because you may not have access to this type of specific program, but you could replicate that. And I think the three components are individual coaching. So these are young mid-career physicians interested in leadership. So the three components are individual coaching with some sort of personality assessment, some sort of assessment of themselves. Some didactics, so they have to learn some of the language of leadership, whether that's negotiation skills, whether that's finance, and we're not trying to get them to master. They're not going to be monitoring our bonds and our bond ratings, but they
right.
need to have some language around that. And then running a small test to change project. And so I think those three components are things that could be replicated by any physician watching this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
using resources like coaching, tapping into some books or some podcasts that talk about healthcare and healthcare finance, and then finding a way to get involved, like you said, with a corporate change process, realizing it's probably going to be unpaid, but it gives you incredible experience and exposure. And I'd strongly encourage that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I met a physician who created an online leadership course that that is didactic and stuff like that, and you can, you pay for the course and you can log in and you work through it at your pace, right? So, and and I've talked to a few universities that have CMO courses and stuff. So, there's there are resources out there, and I think sometimes it takes someone like me to point people in the right direction, and I am seeing through this podcast and through the work of recruiting leaders, like I am seeing people ask for, for opinions on what's available. And it's interesting, on the US side, there's a lot more available than the Canadian side, and it's probably by sheer, numbers and volume and stuff like that. But yeah, it is interesting. And I do enjoy kind of having that conversation with someone that says, okay, well, I'm going to introduce you to this person about, some didactic learning, or, I'll find you a mentor, and stuff like that. Right. So it is, it's definitely an interesting space and stuff like that. So I've enjoyed this conversation, and I will reserve the right to bug you again about, future things as we go. I'm coming up on a year of podcasting, so I'd like to do a kind of year in review post at some point, and then think about, I'm starting to get people reach out about specific types of things and specific topics. So I think I might try next year to address certain things that arise from people and stuff, and then align guests with, who can shed light on that specific type of thing. Right. So I will probably be in your inbox at some point in 2026. And I appreciate your time talking today, sharing your experience, and I really appreciate it.
Sounds good. Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks
All
for
right,
having me.
take care.
Take care.